The reason that I think I'm so much bigger in the frame than you is because you're the neighbor Wilson from Home Improvement. You make the happiest. Hello, hello, our audience. You got to sit up straight, man. Didn't they
The
ever teach you
challenge,
posture?
the challenge is I have that big screen and the damn camera is on top of it. So
Uh,
I really
oh,
need to
you have
stretch.
big
I
screen
need to
problems.
s- I need to
Oh.
stretch to I will not reply to this. Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast, where we demystify enterprise architecture and business process management.
We're here to bring best practices and lessons learned from our years to your ears, as well as interviewing friends we met along the way on our professional journeys.
My name is Roland Volt, and I'm joined today by my co-host, JM Erlinson. Hey, JM, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Roland. It's funny. Behind the scenes, people don't know what we do, but if they're eagle-eyed viewers out there, you might spot that Roland is wearing the same T-shirt you saw in a different episode. That's right. Today we are doing the unique thing of doing a double recording day. Oh,
That's only what you say.
uh,
I follow the principle, same shirt, different day. So don't worry about
see,
that.
I changed my shirt to try and make it look like we were doing it, but no, you didn't
No,
get the memo.
you just had lunch, and then you dropped
Uh-huh.
everything on your shirt. So different story.
Uh-huh. I was actually doing, I actually went out for a run. So I've been training up to do this like very long walk that I'm looking to do in sort of the end of the year 2024. And I've had to start like actually training for distance, not just running, but like literally just distance movement. So finding time to go and take my lunch break and have it on the road and come back, you get a little sweaty because it's still hot in Toronto. And so I had to change my shirt for multiple reasons, not just for the podcast.
I'm not sure, JM. I watched one of your BPM walk videos, and it was in July, and you were babbling about that's a little bit nippy and snow was falling. So I'm not sure if I can believe that.
Those are published out of order, my friend. It's the thing is I recorded them hoping that they might be published, near when I recorded them. But there's one that I love, which is, and it's the first snow. And I want to think about operational resilience and disaster recovery and like unforeseen conditions. And yep, that was published in the middle of summer.
Yep. Good job. Good job. Whoever uploaded
No,
it.
I love it. I love it. Don't worry. If you're watching out there, we still love you, and we're still going to keep doing those BPM walks. But meanwhile, Roland, how are you doing today with now we've recorded one. Are you all fired up for our topic today? Are you ready to
Oh,
go?
like crazy. Yeah, like crazy. Now we don't have those disturbing guests. So this will be an episode just between you and I.
Oh yeah.
And we also will do basically, and we announced it in season 6, we will do basically a follow-up episode of, in this case, episode 70, when we spoke about BPM use cases. And I don't know if you noticed it, but the subtitle of our podcast is EA and BPM Demystified. So what we're going to talk about today is obviously the EA part, as announced, and come up with a couple of use cases that we think are maybe a little bit more IT focused, to say at least,
Yeah.
and are not contradictory but complementary to episode 7. And for that
Yeah.
wonderful thing, the eagle-eyed people will not only notice the same shirts, they will also notice the last one was episode 70. And since this is twice as good, this episode is episode 77. So,
Ooh.
So,
Yeah.
JM.
Well, so we're gonna let's review before we actually get
Yes.
started. Let's review some of the things we talked about before, to just sort of go through the kinds of things you might find in traditional what is viewed as BPM, and then let's talk about because there are some tech outs out there. Don't be afraid. You're welcome in. I want to sort of democratize the conversation, but there are still technical things that need to go on to make sure the enterprise works. And enterprise architecture, y'all people are important. We still love you. So let's start with BPM, and then let's talk about EA, and then we're going to bring it all together in our last part, which is just sort of how they intersect with each other and work together to make this the company run and just to avoid crashes and issues as you deploy your architecture. So where do we start with BPM, right? We start with the process lifecycle. From my perspective, a quick review is we have processes that are in flight and executing that we choose to measure and monitor to try and understand where they might be going, whether there's issues or you can see the bottlenecks issues with data, early access to the process and unexpected executions. That execution data becomes part of a conversation around roadmap and strategy to align that with the way in which you want to do business, which becomes a solution design conversation around a single solution to solve a problem, a blueprint for an execution that itself gets implemented through either change to systems or change to ways of working and how people run the business. So it is a life cycle that we go through over and over again. And along the way, we create a bunch of artifacts. So why don't you talk about the BPM artifacts that get created as part of this life cycle?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. And by the way, this is where it all comes together. And what I don't like, and I know you will disagree, I don't like the use of the term enterprise architecture for the way how the majority of the industry uses it, because they actually mean IT architecture. To me,
Yes.
EA is much better. And maybe I read too long, too often the TOGAF document. It's basically describing the architecture of an enterprise, which could be the organization or even larger, right? An ecosystem.
Right. Yeah.
But independent of that, whatever your use case is, you will have the same challenges. You need an inventory, you need a repository. Where do I store all that stuff, right? How do I analyze what I have in the repository,
Mm-hmm.
And then once you've done this, well, how do I communicate? How do I publish the documentation? How do I do version management and all that stuff, or standardize on things? Why is my picture with triangles and rectangles and circles so much better than yours that uses ovals and pentagrams and whatnot? That doesn't make sense. So how do we develop a common language and bring that in? And then from that, and maybe JM, you spoke about the life cycle. Maybe you can hook on all those extra points that we spoke about in episode 70. There were use cases in the context of that life cycle.
Yeah, I mean, there's some other use cases that come up as you look at doing this for instance, system implementation. So how do we make sure that the as designed and as executed are as close as possible? Well, there's that intermediate step, as implemented, right? So how do you generate requirements documents? How do you communicate those effectively with your partners? How do you receive feedback and collaborate in the blueprinting process and iterative design for execution? And then we talk about how do you support the rollout of new processes, so that both in terms of the rollout of an application's functionality as well as the rollout of the expectations on people and what they're supposed to do. So that's an important piece. All the way throughout, we are looking at this from an understanding of where things are struggling or where things are succeeding. So process improvement is a big centering characteristic of all these things, but also process context, right? So then we talk about blueprint in the context of the insights from our mining exercises or from our, different sources of BI, the perishable insights we use to help us understand the sort of the temperature of the thing we're cooking up, which is good process. And then ultimately that results in end state monitoring to try and see the efficacy of what we're doing. So that's the execution monitoring. That sort of finishes the loop and comes back around with process mining and process modeling combined into a conversation around process excellence. And I think that's a good place to sort of stop from that point of view. That completes the auxiliary components of BPM. The core components. I want to talk about the auxiliary components with you, though. We think about process, but there is a whole ecosystem of things around business process that is business relevant. Talk to me about how you extend that use case beyond just the conversation around just the model itself.
Well, yes, and I don't want to go into a full repetition of what we spoke about already to burn valuable time in this podcast and everybody gets bored. But just maybe in a list, we spoke about customer experience design, right? And one could say, well, it's the same. It's just looking from a different angle. We also spoke about risk management and regulatory compliance. And I think that's also an IT-related use case, which we haven't covered back then, but we will today. And then we spoke about the digital twin of an organization, where you marry the description of what an organization does with the prescription, things like simulation, with the measurement of the as is, the mining technology, to see if you have a full loop and you actually can run something in parallel to the execution and see if you're on track. And then lastly, we figured out, well, there's a quality management aspect that BPM in the past was hooked up. Oh yeah, you need, for your ISO certifications, you need processes and all that type of stuff. I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about similar things, maybe in the term of an enterprise management system. Also with our more EA/IT related use cases that we have. But JM,
Yeah.
did I cover everything that we spoke about? I think so.
Yeah, mostly the one thing we haven't talked about is sort of the through line of like the governance of all this stuff, but that's more of like a tool conversation rather than a necessarily a practice thing. That like it's the mechanics of how you govern approvals and reviews and publish information into like a governed and controlled space. And there's other things that like other auxiliary practices like Lean Six Sigma and Agile and other things that have sort of intersected, or frameworks and standards that come into play. But really what we've talked about is the core of how a lot of organizations conceptualize BPM. And the truth is that, and I think that we disagree a little bit on this, but I think that this is an important starter for the conversation, because after 10 minutes of this, the real core of what we're trying to do here is talk about how enterprise architecture as a discipline really does eventually hook back into that, and maybe not even hook back into that. It is the other side of that. So Roland, let's start with a conversation and definition from your perspective about what you see as the nail of enterprise architecture. What is it, if you were to put it into words that don't include the terms we've used to define business architecture, but they are adjacent enough that you can see the interconnectivity between them?
Yes, I think that when you look into the history of the discipline, right, and in all seriousness, EA as a discipline is super immature after 40 years. Even when you think about Zachman and all those early guys who tried to structure it, well, what in all reality, and you and I spoke about that in our most popular episode, number 2, right, where we spoke about what is that whole BPM and EA stuff and why do I need it. But mostly from a historical perspective, EA people came from an IT background. It's programmers, it's people who had the need to get their stuff sorted out, and stuff, that very scientific term that I use here, could be anything. It could be applications, it could be servers, it could be puffy clouds, it could be VMs, whatever it is. So there was a need, and it actually started with hardware back in the day. There was a need to manage this, and then over time it grew up to applications. And I think the first thing, and by the way, way back when working with that small audit company, I had an article in CIO.com where we went a little bit retro. I think it was like 2017. So I'm going to link to that article in the show notes as well, if you want to hear a little bit more about the history. But I think there's the first use case is a combined thing, and that is app/IT portfolio management, right? So the catalog of what I have and how do I manage that. And then there's a technique that you apply to it, which is app rationalization, right? So I think both go hand in hand, and the way how I see it, application rationalization, and we'll talk about the different areas in a minute, is to me more like a snapshot, to say, oh, what do I have? Yes, I need a catalog, my portfolio, right? What the baseline for it. And then you apply certain analysis techniques on it and say, like time charts and these type of things. And then when you have that snapshot, well, you know what to change. So now you're going into a practice of managing all these things versus analyzing them. Does that make sense, Sham?
It does, and I think if I can just back it up a slight amount, I feel like this rationalization conversation is something that happens on the process side. The big difference here is that a manual process like being something that somebody could execute on, often doesn't have like a license or infrastructure cost. So there is very specifically like reasons why that might be something that would have value to consolidate beyond the standardization conversation, right? Application rationalization does just have like a bottom line effect.
Do you really think so? I think that I would use a different term. I would call it process improvement. If you want to go in that, how do I identify improvement opportunities?
Sure, but process rationalization exists though.
Well, it also can have a bottom line impact, if you reduce the amount of X and all that type of stuff. I think that the quality
Sure.
criteria is the analysis is a single snapshot. You do it now. If you would
Right.
do it tomorrow, you might have a different result, right? While
That's a good point.
the portfolio management is an ongoing activity, right? And that's
Yeah.
where we see things like whatever annual surveys to your application owners, right? And say,
Yeah.
is that information still correct? And then you want to have them press a button that confirms, yay, we're good, or whatnot. I think the complexity that comes into this is, and that is different to processes, which are hugely abstract, is that with the IT stuff where you have different versions and runtime stuff, so in the instances that you have, right? And that adds complexity. Yes, we still have Microsoft Word as an application in our organization. Yes, we use it. Well, which version of Word? JM uses his old 386 laptop, so he has some Word 4 for DOS on it and is happy with it. And others have Office 365, and are happy with that. So you need to get the different versions, the different instances in there. And this is where you have the connection to CMDBs, because that can change every single day, right? And obviously that has an impact then on your analysis that you want to do.
Yeah, and the other thing about the portfolio management is it also includes some really key information that assigns ownership and responsibility. And when I think about ownership, responsibility, Roland, you love to say one throat to choke, right? That's your application ownership is a really important part of this, and a portfolio needs to have this question and the answer to it: who owns which application? Who do I need to go to talk about capabilities of those applications, whether or not I'm allowed to use it for certain business functions, what its life cycle is going to be, its roadmap? We'll talk about road mapping and planning in a second. Somebody who can answer questions and being able to contain that within a repository, an application inventory, which is what a lot of people talk about. That's an important part of giving people an asynchronous access resource that can turn into a catalyst for problem solving.
Mm-hmm. But it's also, and we spoke about that in the context of process mining and process improvement. You have to define, and business people do that, what a good process looks like for you. Is it the fastest, the cheapest, the least compliant, whatever, right? You have a similar set of criteria when you go through your application or IT rationalization, right? You look at things like cost, right? You look at how do you adhere to the standards that you have defined for your applications? How do you fit your projects into this, right? All those things.
Of course. And you can also see like feedback and user scoring. Like example, you could go back and say, hey, listen, people hate this application. Now we have like a reason to go and do something about it. And we can get a whole bunch of KPIs also about performance. Like application performance, you can see historical downtime, or you can see like what's its response time of this application, or you can see what sort of costing it has based off of different characteristics, data centers, or the licensing costs and things like that. You can even contract management on that side, right?
So same question that process people have. How does a good process look like? Well, EAs should come up with that catalog of what does a good portfolio look like, right? Because you might have policies for whatever. There's no shadow IT allowed, or you have the say it nicely, the federated approach, which basically means everybody does what they want, and whatnot. But you, as an organization, you need to decide what is your way of handling this.
Yeah, and that's a tough thing to come about, because there's not only the idea of how you're going to handle certain challenges, but what that impact is going to be. So that's the next piece of the puzzle, even before we get into planning and things like that, is that you're looking at an inventory. So you're creating a snapshot and a view into things that also indicates what relies on what. So it's not just technologies; it's also talking about interfaces and data. And so now we get into a layer of data governance, data privacy, data security architecture, and how you handle interfaces so you can understand handoffs between applications that need to be developed. It's almost like each interface itself is its own sort of application of sort, right?
Yeah. You know what the biggest challenge is?
Sure. What?
Nobody cares. That's
Ah,
except those
not
guys
not until the regulators
who
come, though,
do.
right?
Well, yeah, fair. But talk to a business unit lead and say, oh, we can do this because our standard for interfaces is blah techno mumbo jumbo, right? And what will be the result? You will get the
Yeah.
stare, right? You will get the stare, and that person either does not understand or understands and hate you, or whatever the result is. It's for them, it's not acceptable. For them, it's
Right.
just another blocker on their way of getting something accomplished. So there's a fine line that you have to walk, because as always, it's the people that are the problem. But
Yeah.
I'm with you. I'm with you. It's a lot of background stuff that's not customer or user or even business facing, and business people are wondering,
Hmm.
why do we have to pay so much money for it? And when you look into IT department budgets, well, guess what? How many percent go into just keeping the lights on projects, right?
Yeah, and also
And
avoiding risk, right? And that's
yeah,
the next piece of the
whatever.
puzzle
Yeah.
here is risk. I've talked to a lot of CIOs who say, like, the thing that I want most is to just not appear in the news. I want to keep our company out of the papers, because when we're in the papers, it's because of a data breach or because of an issue with how our systems. I mean, you look at some major banks who had like system issues that allowed people to do things they weren't supposed to do, and they ended up having to suffer a huge loss to their public face and trying to earn customer trust back. And then the regulators come calling. You don't want to face that. And managing your portfolio, which includes a link to where your risks might be on applications, where the security is required for those applications, data and rest, data and transit, in the form of interfaces, and how you manage that, what standards you comply to. Do you comply to standards? And so how you're going to do that, that's a big part of sort of, it's not specifically the portfolio management, but I think it's a good part of the conversation around how the portfolio starts to branch out into other things you need to be aware of. But I think that one of the things we've sort of been talking about is all these use cases about the current. And I want to take us to a brief break because people's brains are burning, and then I want to talk about how we plan the future with EA, because enterprise architecture use cases, as you mentioned, aren't just a snapshot, right? Your business is in motion, and we're going to come back after the break and talk about that. So we'll leave you with a question, audience, before we do that, and talk about how you have applied BPA use cases or business process management use cases, and what interface and interaction do you have with EA? How have you worked with your enterprise architecture team? Or if you're an enterprise architect, how have you gained traction and recognition for the enterprise architecture use cases you have right now, creating a snapshot and assessing your application portfolio? We'll come back after a short break with our second section, EA in Motion, where everything comes together.
It's just changing. The wind will blow, but it's just changing. It's just changing. It's just changing. It's just changing.
And welcome back. Well, JM, I think we covered the most obvious use case for EA, because that's what most people think. Oh yeah, it's app and IT thing management, on this. The ultimate question is obviously, well, I do have a CMDB. That's enough. I don't need more. So there are a couple of more use cases, right? And I think now that we've determined what we have and where we have some issues, well, what would be the next logical step then, JM?
I think we need to ask some hard questions about where things are going. Because
Mm-hmm.
the thing from my perspective is, that this snapshot is never really truly good enough. It's like airplane food. You have a you bite and then it's gone and then you forget all about it, right? But you want a hearty meal, something that will really power you for a long time. And you need to have a meal plan, something you can continuously eat and evolve as you go. I see this the next logical thing to do is to do road mapping and planning, because
Mm-hmm.
your business isn't sitting still. Your IT and enterprise architecture also cannot sit still. So there are constantly application updates as you move from version to version. There are introductions of new applications, the decommissioning of other applications that are no longer relevant. I mean, things you found in terms of like redundancy analysis and in overlap, you need to rationalize those applications. So you need to see what the future is going to be. Who is going to fulfill those applications functions previously for the organization? Should they still be required? And so you're going to lay out, not just today, but you're going to lay out a series of time scaled views into this application portfolio. And you're going to plan probably different scenarios. So scenario planning on how you might address different types of challenges with different configurations of your architecture. And so this road mapping exercise is, and this one is, you know, kind of like was it Sisyphus who pushed the boulder up the hill and then it fell back down and pushed the boulder. Kind of feels a little bit like that, but the truth is you need to keep it updating, keep updating as requirements change, which we'll talk about in a second, and as the particular applications themselves change. You don't own the vendors you have. You can do vendor and contract management. That's an interesting use case for EA, but really you need to roadmap and plan that based off the best knowledge you have and the best strategy you have in order to help achieve your business goals. So this is a time scaled conversation.
I agree. And there's also, and this is what I see in most organizations. You have a very focused look, focused in the bad sense, a very focused look of the people in EA groups to say, oh yeah, this is my little playground. And I'm
Hmm.
planning how I do my little playground. And they come up with their own ideas and whatnot, but they are not set up in a way that they have either responsibility for other areas, or they have a group that can decide on where shall we go. You know, the architecture review board, the committee of no, as we labeled it a couple of
Oh
episodes
yeah.
ago. Um, I don't know if that is their job. So where's that group of people who take that next step? You, JM, as your whatever IT owner, application owner, you have an idea. Oh yeah, I know there's a new version coming out. I need to update this. I you create a business case for it. Of course, it makes sense to upgrade to the next major version, even though the vendor charges us an arm and a leg for it. Sapana. It makes sense to do this.
Oh, shots fired.
The point is you need to say, okay, how do we implement that in the organization? And just stick with the SAP example. There's no stone in the organization that does not get turned around in an SAP implementation. So you need to coordinate that.
So you're talking about implementations.
The plan for an implementation.
And when you talk about implementations, Roland, you're starting to talk about projects, right?
Not
You're
yet.
getting close. Okay, you're getting close.
I'm talking about content. It's like, okay, hey, I have this software. It has certain modules. I know the end of life. All those informations, and I have in my little head, I have a little timeline in how I want to change stuff. That does not necessarily fit into the timeline that you have in your head, right? So there
Yep.
needs to be some arbitration, some form of negotiation, some form of collaboration between the two of us and all those 350 other idiots who have the same jobs that we have in our organization, right? And setting this up. So what you need is the individual perspective. You come up with your roadmap and your plan, but you need to coordinate it. And that is
Yeah.
where you then come into the project portfolio management. And the question is, and I don't want to go too far into the distinction, is that a strategic portfolio management? Is that
Or
lean portfolio management?
mhm.
Is that the same? So now we're talking to the point where then the rubber hits the road, because somebody will have to say, oh yeah, I take JM's idea for 20%, I take Roland's idea for 5%, and the rest is provided by whatever. And that will be our first release. And it will have a price tag, and it will have efforts that are associated with it, data migrations and blueprint updates and reorgs and whatever needs to be done, phasing out of systems and puffy clouds and whatnot, So that comes with a price tag. And then you have to sell it. Oh, and by the way, the people you sell it to, the guys with the purse or gals with the purse, they want to know, well, JM, what's next? Right? So they just don't agree to, I have this $500,000 or 5 million proposal that I want. But they want to know, is that an open barrel, a big money pit that you buy into? And at the end of the day, you've spent $100 million for what? So I think that is the big challenge that you have. And you need to make that clear.
And the other thing about this is you want to be able to provide an ROI estimate, or at least some sort of like value benefit analysis for this particular project. And we're looking at, when we say project portfolio, we're not looking at a single project or program. We're looking at the whole of the enterprise and all the things it's trying to do. And that's where we talk about like project rationalization, just like application rationalization. Your IT department, your enterprise architect might be proposing 20 projects a year. You can't do 20, right? You can do 6, maybe 4. Okay, so what is the line we're going to draw? How are we going to score these projects against each other? And then ultimately, where do we make the decision? This is what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to do it.
Oh yeah, that's the big unknown, right? Because
it's hard.
What is the means that you use to do this? Hint, it's capabilities. Right? Because what do you do?
Okay.
Do you just keep the light on? Why do you always have to have the latest version of the software? Maybe there's no need for it. Maybe you're just fine with the one that you have. You have a long-term release that's supported for 5 years, right? When you think about in operating systems and on Linux, that's very, very popular. Right? You don't have to be on every new release and whatnot if you run a server. As long as you get security patches for X amount of years, you might be good. And by then, in 5 years from now, the box that it runs on is an old box anyways. So, right? I think, and that might be one way to help with a budget relief, right?
Yeah.
But I think the key thing is the concept of capabilities. And you and I spoke about capabilities. I need to look up which episode number it was. But
a couple of
very
times.
Early, very early we spoke about that. But the point is, I'm pretty sure I said it because I say that every day. If you come to me and ask for money, JM, right? I would say, okay, JM, answer me a simple question or a set of simple questions. Which capability do you create? Which capability do you change? And which capability do you retire? And if you can't answer any of those, then I would say, sorry, JM, no money for you. That's your hobby project, So I think that's the thing. But there's always
we'll take a look at that when we get to the things combined, because I wanted to touch on a couple more things before we really end. Because you talk about planning, and I think that this is particularly interesting in this incredibly, incredibly dynamic digital world of vendors and this world of a lot of corporate moves that are going on. EA is really a core use case for a lot of companies, is a conversation around M&A and how do you plan M&A to get the most amount of value. Both organizations are going to come in. I mean, we can talk about M&A planning for process, but let's talk about architecture, because they're going to have duplicate probably everything. So
It's
EA
the
does
same.
have a big plan for that, right?
Process is part of an architecture. Just saying.
I
But
know.
to
I
come back,
know,
I
I
agree.
know.
I
Yeah.
agree, JM. When you have a merger or an acquisition, why do you do it in the first place? You could do it to buy market share. You run the two organizations separately and you have a portfolio approach. And I'm pretty sure if we ask our friend
Yeah.
Dan Marquez, he would agree and he would say, sure, you can do this. Um, but most organizations that I've worked with wanted to have something, a word that I hate, some synergies, right? So synergies typically means fire the back office. That's one part of it because you have enough finance and marketing people. But you also might have some synergies in combining technology,
Yeah.
combining processes. So you have a look at that portfolio and then say, okay, hey, which of the two companies does it better? Right. And let's take the better approach and then determine, well, what are the changes that we have to do? Do I take that homegrown app based on Excel from company A, or do I take that commercial off the shelf, whatever product from that little vendor from Germany and roll it out?
Yep.
Right. So those are the questions that you would have to have.
And here's the thing, it's very hard to do that planning unless you have a practice around it. That's why having an EA practice in this particular use case is so valuable, so important. And for companies who are growing through M&A, like there's a lot of work that needs to get done. Acquisitions aren't ones. How many acquisitions has, big Fortune 500 company made this year? I mean, many of them you might not even gotten a press release about. And these are
Yeah.
people in the enterprise architecture space who are constantly trying to rationalize, understand what they have right now, what we have, what we learn from them, what knowledge and practices are we buying versus what are we simply, bringing into our conglomeration and making it just part of our way of doing things. That's an EA use case. But I wanted to go to one more before we take another quick break and then come back with the combination of the two. And the last one I wanted to talk about, Roland, is something that falls under a little bit of a topic we've talked briefly about before, which is operational resilience and disaster recovery. Tell me a little bit about how EA specifically plays into this disaster recovery and resolution conversation.
Yeah, I think it's similar, and that might be a nice bridge. Has a similar challenge because the challenge is I don't know what I have. In the merger and acquisition, there is no standard format. People come and print out inventories in Excel, and then you do some Excel comparison. Horrible, right? Because there's no standardized way of bringing it in. But the question behind this is the question, what do I have? So when we talk about resilience, right, and security attacks and all that type of stuff, guess what? Same question. Well, what do I have? Did JM just download some arbitrary software from the internet? And because he has admin powers, because until 5 seconds ago, he was a trustworthy colleague, he installed that software. You, as the responsible person, don't know anything about it. How do you manage that? Right? And I'm pretty sure there's tools out there that do the monitoring. I know in the little audit firm that I worked, we did this in the background. And then if you installed something that was not kosher, you got a friendly email with a timeline until you have to have this deinstalled, and confirm and whatever. So you have to put something in place just to avoid the risk that will occur.
Yeah, and so that gives us a not complete, because we're going to go and complete it with the sort of connective tissue between BPM and EA, but it gives us a good view into the EA use cases. And I'll take us to another brief break. I'm sure once again your brains are burning, but think about what we've mentioned that you do. So if you're EA or EA adjacent, how much have you been involved in? What organizational changes have you gone through in your company, like a merger or an acquisition, that have required the sort of consultation of enterprise architects and conversation around rationalization, consolidation, harmonization of standard applications and approaches for technology? And have you had any interruptions, disasters you had to recover from, and what resources did you need to draw upon from your enterprise architecture group? We'll leave you for a moment and come back with our final section, our combined thoughts and a conclusion for the episode.
Welcome back to the last segment of today's show. And in opposite to all the other shows that we did, this is not just the goodbye. We actually have some content because, JM, we already, something new, we already spoke about that briefly, right? When we were talking about capabilities, and is capability the glue between more business-oriented and more technical-oriented architecture work? In my mind, it is. Right. But there is a criteria or another function that capabilities use that I would love you to talk a little bit about more. And that is, it's the vehicle to describe how you bring a strategy to life.
Yeah. And that's a connection in, right?
Yeah. And then the first question is, JM, what's a strategy?
Well, I think a strategy is all about setting out business goals and how you plan at a high level to achieve them. So, what is our vision? What is our mission? What is our objective? How do we plan to achieve that objective with a series of initiatives? And then how are we going to measure the success of that objective? And how do we iterate on that as we develop our business? And this strategy needs to be aligned with a lot of different people involved in the conversation, whether or not it be people who understand the market, people who understand the industry, people who understand the capabilities of the organization, people who understand the team in itself, the people who these are a lot of different people who talk about this, but they all sort of center around, in my opinion, the process and architecture that you use to execute on this. So, let's say I'm a big retail company, and I want to say, listen, I'm going to also become a bank. That's a strategy, but it needs to be realistic. So you need to have the right inputs to help me understand what steps I need to go through in order to achieve becoming a bank as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see a couple of examples where that strategy was executed very well. I know a fairly major financial institution down in the southern United States who was an insurance company that had a strategy to expand their offerings to be more of a bank and a lending institution, and had to undergo a series of process and architecture and regulatory obligation fulfillment changes in order to achieve that goal. It was a pretty difficult strategy to execute on. But I think that what you're leaning towards here is that eventually it had to come down to the capabilities. What capabilities did they have to enable in order to make that transformation to achieve their strategy? And if part of the strategy is becoming leaner, what capabilities were they looking to decommission in order to save cost of the cost of business? So a strategy is a good motivator for change, or motivator for sort of establishing a way of working. And I think that when we talk about BPA, or business process analysis, business process management, and EA as two separate things, the strategy really shows that they might actually be a lot closer than you think, because both of them are part of that same conversation as to how we're going to get there. Does that make sense to you?
It does. I would say it slightly differently. I agree with you, by the way. So it's literally just different words. I think capabilities are the words to describe something. If you have a strategy and your objective is to become, transform from an insurance company to a bank, right? Then you need to describe what to change, right? And capabilities are the what. And then you need to go, and this is obviously by now everybody has noticed it. You and I have different perspectives on this. You need to come up with a description of how you do this. Right. And we will talk, little spoiler alert, we will have another collaboration with another podcast. We will talk with Dan and Greg from the Strategic podcast, what a hard word, about those topics. But you will have to come up with your operating model, your target operating model that you want to do. How do we do this? And that includes then, and now comes the TOGAF guy out, in me, where you have the
Well,
different,
hello.
yeah, hello, where you have the different architecture description phases in the architecture development method, and
Yeah,
that goes from strategy through business architecture to application architecture and data and technology and all that stuff. And you need to get it aligned. And one thing that I found, and obviously we're all agile nowadays.
sure,
What
sure.
nobody wants to do is sure. What nobody wants to do is creating documentation. But I really am a big fan of the old SAP stuff where they said, yep, we need a business blueprint and we need a technical blueprint. And
Yeah.
both artifacts need to work together.
And that's where we tie all this stuff together, right? Because the idea is that when you're changing capabilities, you need to understand the demand on that capability and the realization of that capability. And so when I take a look at building a solution for let's say how we do business, I need to understand the business support and the business process that I'm looking to achieve, and also sort of why. So maybe even a customer journey or a customer experience. That's something we talked about on the business process side. I need to understand the realities of my application landscape and the capabilities I'm able to create with this application landscape. Okay, guess what? We've just talked about that on the EA side. And I need to understand the technology that underpins what I'm doing and the capabilities of the organization to achieve this change. Okay, guess what? That's our roadmap and planning side. And so now to do a solution design, a full solution design, we kind of have to have everything together. And I think where a lot of projects fall apart is when they forget a partner in this conversation. The business can demand everything they want, but if your application architecture simply doesn't support it, well, guess what? You don't do that. Unless you're going to sell it a lot of money to implement a brand new platform. Guess what? You need to change your ambitions to align better with the way your strategy is being deployed in your architecture and capabilities. And that's a conversation that has to happen between your application architects and your enterprise architects and your business architects. And the fact that they're so separated a lot of the time makes that a hard conversation to have. So Roland, how do you bridge that gap? How do you convince people you're part of the same team?
That is a very interesting question because there are different roles of architects. Being the change agent, being the strategic advisor and whatnot, since, to come back to the beginning of this conversation, EA as a discipline is so immature. In most organizations,
Yep.
those guys are not even on the radar, right? And I just listened to a podcast yesterday where they brought up the example of Blockbuster and Netflix, where Blockbuster way back when wanted to buy Netflix for whatever, 50 million or so, and they didn't. But the CEO of Blockbuster at that point in time was very sharp. He saw everything, and he wanted to change the strategic direction of the organization, including building a streaming service. And then the financial shareholders said, no, we want to have more money. You go back to your retail stuff. They fired the CEO, and the new guy just executed on what his overlords told him. Right. So
Yep.
we all knew how that ended. But I think this is also the point where you can see some dysfunctionality in organizations where people don't talk to each other. And
Yeah.
I honestly do not have a good idea how to do this. Because in theory, a chief information officer, right, should bridge that gap. Because in reality, these are all the techies, in this. You do not have a business representative necessarily on the board level, right? So what type of org unit do you need to put in place where you have those conversations, where somebody can stand up and say, yep, I see where you're going. I looked at what we have, did an analysis, right? Say we can do or cannot do this, or this is what it would take, so that you make an informed decision of buying a competitor or building your own stuff, or just don't do it. And this is why you have all those mystic thoughts around strategy. Those are the gurus in pinstripes who know everything. No, they just make up stuff.
Yeah.
They just pretend.
Can I put two topics here? Number one is, I think it's very interesting that you don't see a lot of board level representation for process architecture. I mean, I've seen a lot of VPs of process, but I don't think I've ever seen like a chief process officer at an organization, and that's interesting. But number two is that one other wedge that I wanted to introduce here is I've seen a chief risk officer become that bridge maker, because risk applies to both process and architecture. It becomes sort of like this unifying characteristic, kind of like a common enemy, like they unites us in this like shared vision of eliminating risk for the organization. And in some ways that becomes kind of a lever for forcing collaboration and conversation earlier in the process and seeing each other as a partner rather than sort of the opposite force. Like, oh, I always want to do something cool, but the IT folks always say no. Oh, I want to update things, but the business people say it's going to ruin their business. Like, that's not what we want to see. We want to see people working together and having conversations. So using a sort of third party, like a risk, that isn't a terrible plan. And I think it's worked before.
Yeah, that just so I don't think that the risk guys are the right ones, but that tells me that we definitely
I've seen it
need
work
an
though.
well, we definitely need an episode about risk and compliance management. So,
Yes,
dear
for sure.
listeners, when you're out there and by coincidence you work in that field and you have strong opinions on that topic, how risk and compliance can be a useful contributor to all things architecture, please reach out. We're happy to have you on the show. But I don't know. To come back to your point, I don't know if they can play that role. I think risk people are good in creating budgets, so they're a good vehicle to, if you want to implement a transformation, to wave the flag and say, oh, by the way, if you do this, you're standing with more than one leg in jail. Right. And then everybody's scared and they say, I think we talk to the risk people first, So that's a relatively easy way. So they should be your friends. But I don't know if their role is being the transformation trigger. I just don't see it.
Sure. Then why don't we talk about one last point before we close the episode for today? And we had him on the episode a couple episodes ago, which is Mike DeCamp, about new product development or planning. How does this become a unifier for process and architecture?
That's interesting, because on the one hand side, it applies everything that we just spoke about. If you want to bring in a new product or develop a new product, you need to understand what do you have. You need to analyze it. You need to see which ingredients you have in your organization and which ones you might have to stand up or buy or whatever, right, on this. But then the flip side is, once you have packaged something, right, that might be a physical product or might be a software or might be a service, right, even that, well, then this thing becomes its own thing with its own life cycle. So now it applies to all things in your architecture. There's another set of building blocks that you have, but they also could be used in your organization as well. Even though you might have thought you built this for an external customer, because you now stand up capabilities that you might not have had before. And now you go back to close it out, to close the loop. Now you go back and say, oh, I added those 3 capabilities. Well, what do these capabilities enable us on a strategy level? Right. And then maybe some smart person, definitely somebody smarter than I, might go and say, oh, great idea. Now we can do this and that and that. So I think it's iterative. It's loops. Everything is a loop. Right. But
everything
at the end of the day
is a loop.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, I think you need to understand, and that might be some good closing words. You need to understand your architecture, how things are structured. You need to understand what you have, business or technology. And you need to have the organizations with which you can make decisions and manage this stuff and somehow tell the roles what they're supposed to do or not, And I think that's the biggest challenge that we see when it comes to growing the maturity, because at least in the EA, in the IT-focused EA use case, it's immature. We don't even have a agreed upon set of KPIs that we want to measure, right? With process, it's simple, right? Do we make more money? Do we have happier customers, right? But in IT, right? And that's where the discipline is struggling. But again, there's that wonderful article that I would put in the show notes that talks about it ad nauseum.
And speaking of the show notes, Roland, I think that was a great way to close it. We are encouraging people to gain a new level of maturity and appreciation for these disciplines and the capabilities that they bring to the table. And I'm so glad everyone has come along with us. And so a huge thank you to our friends out there in listener land. Thanks for coming along the journey with Roland and I today. Thank you to Roland. This was a great conversation and I've really enjoyed it. And of course, you can find out more about this by going to whatsyourbaseline.com, or please follow us on LinkedIn, leave comments, give us feedback. We love hearing from our audience. Roland, this was a ton of fun, and I'm looking forward to even more fun with you this season on What's Your Baseline. But until then, I've been J.M. Erlinson.
And my name, as always, is Roland Wold.
And we will see you in the next one.